The night sky stretched endlessly over the African savanna 2.5 million years ago, with no light but the distant stars. The wind swept across the grasslands, carrying the faint sounds of predators on the move. And in that darkness, a small band of Homo habilis huddled close together. They had no fire to drive away the cold or the shadows, only the warmth of their bodies and the comfort of closeness to withstand the vast, overwhelming fear. We often remember Homo erectus as the ancient humans who endured for 2 million years, but few know that before Erectus, there was another kind of human, humble, fragile, yet astonishingly resourceful. They were Homo habilis, the very first humans to hold in their hands tools they had crafted themselves. They were not mighty warriors, not tall, not faster than the beasts around them, but they had hands that could grip stone, shape sharp edges to cut flesh and crack bones. And from those crude, broken shards of stone, human history began to turn a new page. In the shadows of prehistory, surrounded by nightly dangers, Homo habilis lived, struggled to survive, and left the very first footprints on the path that would one day lead to us. This is the story of humanity's forgotten dawn. 2.5 million years ago, the African continent was a harsh and ever-changing land. Endless grasslands stretched into the horizon, broken by scattered woodlands where ancient elephants, primitive zebras, and massive herds of antelope roamed with the rhythm of the seasons. The climate was unstable, sometimes scorched by severe droughts, sometimes weighed down by heavy rains, creating a challenging environment for any creature struggling to survive. In this landscape, from the ancient apes known as Australopithecus, who had existed for millions of years, an evolutionary turning point emerged, and Homo habilis was born. Australopithecus had once dominated wide regions. They could climb trees, gather fruit and roots, and occasionally use simple tools, but they were still half ape, half human beings. As Africa's climate grew drier, forests gave way to vast open savannas, and food was no longer as easily found. This shift forced a small branch of Australopithecus to evolve into an entirely new species, one with a different kind of intelligence and hands capable of far greater dexterity. That species was Homo habilis, named by scientists as the handyman. Homo habilis were not tall. On average, they stood only about 4 to 5 feet, weighing less than 50 kilograms. Their skulls were much smaller than those of the later Homo erectus, with brain volumes of only 600 to 700 cm3. Yet, this was already far beyond their Australopithecus relatives. Their hands had more agile thumbs, shorter and sturdier finger bones, allowing them to grip and manipulate hard objects with greater precision. This was the key that opened the way for stone tools, tools that would trigger revolutionary changes in human evolution. Though their bodies still bore many primitive, animal-like traits, Homo habilis stood at the very threshold of what we now call humanity. They still depended on nature for survival, still lived under constant threat from predators, but they had begun to fight back, not just with brute strength, but with intelligence and creativity. The combination of larger brains, more skillful hands, and the urgent need to endure in a harsh environment turned them into pioneers, opening the first chapter of a new era. The African landscape of that time was not only the brutal stage of predator and prey, but also a natural laboratory where even the smallest behavioral changes could determine survival. Homo habilis learned to use shards of stone they stumbled upon, realizing that sharp edges could slice through animal flesh or crack bones to reach the rich marrow inside. This discovery drove them to deliberately chip, shape, and eventually craft the earliest tools. Interestingly, Homo habilis did not appear as a sudden, explosive new species. They were more like a quiet, small group flowing within the current of evolution. They lived only in a few pockets of East Africa, places where archaeologists today have uncovered fossilized bones and primitive stone tools, fragmented skulls, jaws with teeth worn down from grinding food, and sharp-edged stones unearthed at Olduvai Gorge provide undeniable evidence that Homo habilis was among the very first members of the genus Homo, and the one who began humanity's long, million-year journey. In their daily lives, Homo habilis likely had no thought of making history. They were simply trying to survive each harsh season, finding food, avoiding predators, caring for their young. Yet every small step, every motion of a hand gripping stone, every moment of cooperation between individuals laid the foundation of human civilization. The dawn of humanity did not arrive with thunder or radiant light. It began with a pair of small hands holding a rough piece of stone. When we look back at Homo habilis, they seem like a fragile bridge between the ancient apes and true humans. Despite their small stature and incompletely developed skulls, they were the ones who crossed the vital threshold. From creatures entirely dependent on nature to beings who could intervene in it with intelligence and skillful hands. This made Homo habilis not just another species in the evolutionary timeline, but the true beginning of what we call humanity. Archaeological studies show that Homo habilis walked fully upright on two legs, though they still retained a strong ability to climb. This gave them the advantage of moving quickly across the open savanna, while also seeking refuge high in trees when danger closed in. Walking on two legs freed their hands, and as those hands became more dexterous, they used them to grasp, strike, and shape the objects around them. Their curved, sturdy fingers, combined with agile thumbs, unlocked countless possibilities their ape ancestors never had. Homo habilis had keen, forward-facing eyes that gave them stereoscopic vision, the ability to judge distance and depth with accuracy. In a world full of predators, this was crucial for survival. But even more importantly, it enabled them to manipulate objects with precision, observe fine details, and develop the skill of toolmaking. Hands, eyes, and an enlarging brain together formed the three essential pillars that paved the way for the next stage of human evolution. What made Homo habilis remarkable was not only their form, but also their way of thinking. Archaeological evidence suggests that they were not hunters of large game, but scavengers. They often waited until lions or hyenas had finished feeding, then used stone tools to cut away scraps of flesh or crack bones for marrow. This reflects a refined capacity for observation and learning. Instead of direct confrontation, they chose a wiser path, seizing opportunities and exploiting what nature and other predators left behind. From this habit, their brains began to be nourished by a new energy source. Bone marrow and animal flesh, rich in fats and proteins, fueled neurological growth. Every small meal not only sustained their bodies, but also, unwittingly, helped expand their brains over time. This was one of the most crucial biological turning points, a diet that actively contributed to intelligence. The carcasses left by other animals unknowingly nourished the very beings who would, millions of years later, become masters of the earth. Still, Homo habilis remained fragile. They could not hunt large animals, nor could they claim vast territories or protect their groups from danger in the dark. Each night, they huddled together to survive the roars of predators. Without fire, they were swallowed by the darkness, left only with the pale light of the moon and the whispering grass. In such conditions, surviving a single night was already a victory. It is easy to imagine that within these small groups, cooperation began to take root. No individual could survive alone, but by sharing food and staying vigilant together through the night, their chances of survival grew. This was the seed of human society. Alarm calls, shared gestures, and exchanged glances may have been the earliest foundations of language. Even brief sounds carried meaning, connection, warning, cooperation. The name handyman refers not only to their tool-making skills, but also to their resourcefulness in life and adaptation. They knew how to scavenge carcasses for meat, how to use stone to gain an advantage, and how to cooperate to protect one another. They were not rulers of their world, but their ingenuity opened the long path that led to Homo erectus, and eventually to Homo sapiens. Today, as scientists unearth fractured skulls and fossilized bones, they recognize that Homo habilis was not just a forgotten species, but the opening chapter of humanity. Those broken fragments of bone, those sharp-edged stones, whisper of a time when humans were far from greatness, but had already planted the first seeds of intelligence. Homo habilis lived for only a few 100,000 years, a brief span compared to the vast timeline of evolution. But every moment of their existence mattered. They were like a flickering flame signaling the coming dawn, faint but bright enough to illuminate the path for the humans that followed. And for that reason, Homo habilis should never be forgotten. In the history of evolution, perhaps no moment was more significant than when a creature first learned to transform a lifeless stone into a purposeful tool. For Homo habilis, that discovery changed their entire way of survival. Before then, their Australopithecus ancestors used sticks or stones by instinct, without creating anything that truly set them apart. But for Homo habilis, a stone was not just something to hold. It could become a weapon, a knife, a hammer, depending on the intelligence and skill of the one who wielded it. Archaeology has left behind clear evidence of this turning point. At Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, scientists uncovered a great number of stone tools, crude, yet showing unmistakable signs of deliberate shaping. Stones were struck in purposeful ways to create sharp edges, unlike naturally broken rocks. This toolkit is known as Olduvai, and it is considered the very first stone tool culture in human history. Though the tools were only small shards of stone, their value is immeasurable, for they marked the moment humanity truly began to stand apart. Picture the scene. A curious Homo habilis, by chance or intent, picked up one stone and struck it against another. A spark flared, and the rock split, leaving behind a sharp edge. In their hands was no longer just a heavy object, but a tool capable of slicing animal hide, cutting meat, and breaking open bones to reach the sweet marrow inside. From a chance discovery, the act was repeated, turned into habit, and finally became a skill passed down through generations. The first Olduvai tools were simple: a stone core, and the flakes struck from it. The core could serve as a hammer. The flakes could serve as knives. With only a few strikes, Homo habilis could create a rough-edged blade. Crude as they were, the difference lay in intent. They made tools deliberately, rather than relying only on what they happened to find. This was a step in thinking, the earliest form of human creativity. Tools completely changed how Homo habilis accessed food. Before, they could only eat fruit, roots, or scraps of meat their teeth and nails could handle. But now, with a sharp stone flake, they could skin animals, slice flesh, even reach nutrient-rich organs. With a heavy stone, they could smash bones to release marrow, an energy-rich resource that few other species could exploit. That energy nourished their brains, fueling the growth of intelligence. These stones were not only for food, but also for defense. When a hyena or leopard approached, Homo habilis was no longer utterly helpless. A rock could be thrown, a sharp flake could wound, or at least warn off a predator. They were still far from being active hunters, but tools gave them a greater chance of survival in a perilous world. Over time, toolmaking also fostered a kind of teaching within their groups. One individual who knew how to strike stones could demonstrate for others, and gradually, the entire group learned. This may have been the very first form of social learning. Knowledge no longer died with a single individual, but could spread, be preserved, and grow. A broken shard of stone was not only a material trace, but also a trace of collective intelligence. The Olduvai tools may not have been as refined as the later hand axes of Homo erectus, but their significance was no less profound. They were humanity's first declaration of independence from nature, no longer fully at its mercy, but beginning to shape it for their own needs. Every sharp-edged fragment, every cut mark on animal bones, every trace unearthed in ancient soil, stands as evidence of the birth of human ingenuity. On dark savanna nights, when Homo habilis gathered around the remains of an animal after the lions had fed, the moonlight shining on small hands, gripping stone flakes to carve meat. Perhaps that was one of the simplest, yet greatest images in all of history. From those shards of stone, the long road of evolution stretched forward, leading to hand axes, stone spears, bows, and arrows. And at last, to the dazzling technologies of modern humanity. If the earliest Olduvai tools were just stones broken by chance, over time, Homo habilis began to select and refine them. They did not simply pick up any rock, but sought out those made of hard, durable material that fractured into sharp edges. Basalt, quartz, and flint were commonly chosen, stones with fine-grained structures that splintered cleanly when struck. This shows that they possessed both observation and memory, remembering which materials were useful and where they could be found. The flakes chipped off were not just the result of accident, but bore signs of intent. Some tools even show evidence that Homo habilis struck stones in specific directions to create the sharp edges they wanted. This was a crucial leap, proving they were not just reacting to the moment, but could imagine an outcome in advance, a primitive form of abstract thought. When striking a stone, they were already thinking of the knife or hammer it could become, not merely acting without awareness. These tools were used in many different situations. Beyond cutting meat and smashing bones, Homo habilis employed them to crack open hard nuts, dig up roots, or even process wood. Where marks on the edges of the stones reveal this variety, from fine striations made by slicing flesh to large fractures caused by heavy blows against bone or timber. This proves that tools were not a one-time invention, but had become an indispensable part of daily life. Another important dimension was the change tools brought to social relationships. With tools, sharing food became easier. A single carcass could yield enough meat and marrow for the whole group, provided they had the tools to process it quickly. This encouraged cooperation and strengthened bonds within the group. One can picture a scene on the savannah, a few individuals cutting meat with sharp stones while others stood guard nearby. That scene may have played out thousands of times, each repetition reinforcing the fabric of community. Tools also shifted roles within the group. Perhaps men more often took the risk of approaching carcasses, while women and children took part in processing and dividing the food. Thanks to tools, women and children could also contribute directly to the group's sustenance, reducing dependence on a few individuals. This was an important step toward the later development of more balanced, multi-role human societies. Compared to modern primates, like chimpanzees or baboons, the difference becomes even clearer. Chimpanzees may use sticks to fish for termites, or stones to crack nuts, but they do not preserve or deliberately reshape tools. Homo habilis, however, selected, shaped, and kept their tools for future use. That difference might seem small, but it was in fact a vast gulf, the divide between instinct and intelligence. The Olduvai toolkit endured for hundreds of thousands of years with little change in form. This might suggest that Homo habilis lacked true creativity, but one must remember, for them, even a single sharp flake was enough to transform life. Inventing new tools mattered less than ensuring that useful ones were passed on and consistently used. In their unforgiving world, stability mattered more than complexity. Yet, the simplicity of Olduvai also reveals the limits of Homo habilis. They had not yet developed the symmetrical hand axes of Homo erectus, nor could they produce tools with standardized shapes and clear functions. This likely reflected constraints in both abstract thought and fine motor skills. They had opened the first door, but still stood on the threshold, awaiting future generations to step through. Even so, the historical value of these earliest tools cannot be denied. Every stone unearthed at Olduvai, every sharp fragment at Koobi Fora, every cut mark on animal bones is evidence of the birth of technology. They show that Homo habilis could think ahead, could reshape the world around them to serve their needs. From that moment on, the path of evolution could never turn back. Tools did more than help Homo habilis survive. They sparked a new evolutionary cycle. Tools enabled better access to food. Better food fueled brain growth. And a larger brain in turn enabled the creation of more refined tools. That cycle continued for millions of years, leading all the way to spaceships and computers. But if that first accidental strike had never happened, if Homo habilis had never lifted a stone and brought it down, we might never have arrived at today. Across the vast grasslands of East Africa, the life of Homo habilis was shrouded in constant unease. They were not rulers of the land, not apex hunters in the food chain, but a small and fragile species struggling to survive in a world teeming with monstrous predators. Around them lurked ancient lions, larger than those of today, stalking the herds, saber-toothed cats with dagger-like fangs, ready to strike at any moment. Massive hyena clans shrieking in the night, and swift, silent leopards concealed in tall grasses. For Homo habilis, each day was not merely a search for food, but a battle for survival against creatures far more dangerous and powerful. Homo habilis had no sharp claws, no long fangs, no superior physical strength. Their only weapons were their growing intelligence and their skillful hands. Yet at this stage, intelligence alone was not enough to make them dominant hunters, and stone tools could only aid in moments of danger or in scavenging leftovers. Thus, they were forced to rely on other survival strategies, alertness, and cooperation within the group. By day, Homo habilis usually moved in small groups of 5 to 10, following dry riverbeds or patches of woodland in search of food. The open savanna allowed them to see far across the land, but it also left them exposed to the gaze of predators. Their survival depended on collective vigilance. At the slightest sign of danger, a sound in the grass or a fleeting shadow, the group would quickly change direction or scramble up nearby trees. Scattered acacias and fig trees became makeshift fortresses, offering safety whenever predators drew too close. But trees were not always within reach, and when night fell, all such advantages vanished. Darkness was the most perilous time. Without fire to ward off predators, Homo habilis had little choice but to huddle in caves or perch high in the branches. Even then, they could still hear the echoes of roars in the distance, the crunch of bones in a predator's jaws, and sometimes the cries of an unfortunate companion. Every night survived was a fragile miracle. This vulnerability forced Homo habilis to live with cunning rather than recklessness. They rarely hunted large animals, instead seeking carcasses abandoned after lions or hyenas had feasted. Such opportunities were dangerous, for predators often lingered nearby, yet the reward was too valuable to ignore. In these moments, they would rush in quickly, slice off scraps of meat with stone tools, crack open bones for marrow, and retreat before being noticed. They survived on what the mighty left behind, but that was precisely what allowed them to endure. Beyond meat, Homo habilis gathered fruits, tubers, and at times even insects. They were not choosy. Anything that offered energy could become food. On the arid savanna, dietary flexibility was essential. Ripe figs hanging from branches, roots hidden beneath the soil, or insects under bark, all were exploited. Their large molars with thick enamel allowed them to crush tough foods, while stone tools helped process the rest. To survive in the wild, Homo habilis had to remain constantly vigilant. Each day was a chain of life or death decisions. Should they approach that carcass? Move toward the shorter grasses? Climb a tree? Or continue toward the water hole? Every choice could mean survival or death. Over thousands of years, such instincts and decisions etched themselves into their intelligence, laying the foundation for adaptability and evolution. Homo habilis was never the strongest species, but it was precisely their weakness that taught them to observe and to endure. They did not confront nature head-on. They learned to slip through its cracks, surviving where brute strength alone would have failed. In the bloody, fireless world of the ancient savanna, this was the only strategy that allowed them to continue walking forward. And out of that fragility, a new kind of humanity was born. Amid the harshness of nature, Homo habilis developed survival strategies that relied not on strength, but on cunning and cohesion. A lone individual was easy prey, but together, as a group, their chances of survival multiplied. Cooperation gradually emerged as a new instinct, not only for gathering food, but also for defending against predators. One can imagine small groups of Homo habilis moving across the savanna, with certain individuals acting as lookouts, constantly scanning the surroundings and raising alarms at the first hint of danger. When the roar of a predator echoed or the stench of carrion revealed hunters nearby, the group immediately shifted direction. This was not organized leadership as in modern humans, but a kind of collective instinct forged through thousands of life and death encounters. By day, threats often came from agile predators like leopards or hyenas. A group of Homo habilis could not fight them head-on, but they could drive them off by throwing stones, shouting, or forming a protective circle with the young in the center. Such actions did not guarantee safety, but sometimes they were enough to make predators turn to easier prey. In nature, courage and solidarity could themselves serve as weapons. When night fell, Homo habilis huddled close in small groups, seeking temporary shelter. Caves and tall trees became their frequent refuges. They had not yet mastered the control of fire, so darkness was their greatest enemy. In the night, their vision weakened, while predators became deadlier than ever. More than once, a member was dragged away in the darkness, while the others could do nothing. That helplessness carved itself into their memory, sharpening their vigilance generation after generation. In this atmosphere of constant tension, the alarm calls of Homo habilis grew vital. A single, sharp cry could signal the entire group that danger was near. Though not yet language, these sounds carried clear meaning. and through such primitive communication, they coordinated more effectively. This may well have been the earliest seed of language, the ability that would one day elevate humanity above all other creatures. Survival meant not only resisting predators, but also competing with other species in the same environment. Larger, stronger primates like baboons could drive them away from fruit trees or water holes. Often, Homo habilis had no choice but to retreat. Yet at times, persistence and ingenuity turned the tables. They learned to wait until rivals had left, to approach from different angles, or to exploit foods others ignored, tools giving them the key advantage. A striking example was bone marrow. Most predators sought only the soft flesh, leaving the bones behind. Homo habilis discovered that within those bones lay a rich source of energy. With stone tools, they cracked them open, reaching food no other species could. This intelligence allowed them to survive, even while holding a lower place in the food chain. All these strategies show how Homo habilis began using intelligence to compensate for physical weakness. They were not as strong as lions, not as fast as leopards, not as ferocious as hyenas, but they were more skillful, more observant, and increasingly capable of predicting enemy behavior. Vigilance, cohesion, and the ability to exploit nature's overlooked opportunities became the foundations of their survival. Each day was a lesson, and each generation built upon the hard-earned knowledge of the last. In that process, a primitive form of society took shape, where cooperation became instinct. Without this crucible of struggle, humanity might never have learned the value of solidarity, and the course of human history could have been entirely different. Nightfall was the greatest trial Homo habilis had to endure. When the sun dipped below the horizon, the savanna was swallowed by dense darkness, lit only by the faint glow of the moon and countless stars. In that darkness, the eyes of early humans weakened. Everything became uncertain, while predators grew deadlier than ever. Distant growls echoed across the plains. Faint footsteps rustled through the tall grass, and the snap of bones in the jaws of beasts carried like a warning bell. For Homo habilis, each night was a tense struggle between the hope of survival and the fear of being torn apart at any moment. Without fire, they could not drive back the night, nor frighten away predators. Their only recourse was to huddle together, seeking shelter in shallow caves at cliff sides, or climbing into the high branches of trees. But even in the trees, safety was not guaranteed. Ancient leopards could climb with speed and stealth, and sometimes even stronger members of their own group fought over the best spots. Infants were the most vulnerable, and no doubt many nights were pierced by the screams of a child, cut short in the grip of a predator's fangs. This helplessness gradually forced Homo habilis to learn caution. Before darkness fell, they often moved to secure spots, a dense thicket, a rocky outcrop, or a crevice in stone that offered cover. Once settled, they clustered tightly together, relying on the presence of the group to lower the risk of attack. In the night, the slightest sound jolted them awake, and alarm cries rang out again and again. In this way, they managed a fragile degree of safety, never complete, but just enough to endure. Darkness was not only a physical danger, but also a haunting burden on the mind. Every night survived etched itself deep into memory, instilling fear, yet also fostering learning. Perhaps in that fear, Homo habilis began to develop the first sparks of imagination. The whistle of wind through cracks in rock, the rustle of animals in the grass, each became a sign that demanded interpretation. They started forming associations. This sound meant danger, that shadow might be a predator. It was not yet belief or myth, but the faint beginnings of abstract thought. In the night, the young were guarded with utmost care, surrounded by adult females, while the stronger individuals positioned themselves on the outer ring. This may have sprung from biological instinct, but it was also a step toward human society. Protecting the young was not only about preserving the next generation, but about safeguarding the future of the group as a whole. Every child that survived the night carried the promise of continuity. In a way, the darkness itself taught Homo Habilis to unite, to share responsibility, to lean on one another. By day, they scattered to forage, but by night, they fused into a single body. Every racing heartbeat in fear, every chorus of alarm calls when danger loomed, helped weave the spirit of community. And that spirit, over hundreds of thousands of years, became an invaluable inheritance upon which later humans would build stronger, more enduring societies. The long, perilous nights forged Homo Habilis in a harsh but effective way. They tested not only the skill of hands and the quickness of minds, but also the bonds of the group. Every individual survived because of the community, and every community endured because each individual gave their part. In the darkness of the savannah, humankind learned its very first lesson in the power of solidarity. When we examine the diet of Homo habilis, we see a pivotal turning point in evolutionary history. Their ancestors, the Australopithecines, relied mostly on plants, with fruit, leaves, and roots making up the bulk of their food. But Homo habilis went further. They began adding significant amounts of animal meat and marrow to their diet. What seemed like a small change carried enormous consequences, for it supplied the energy needed to fuel their steadily expanding brains. Archaeological evidence shows that Homo habilis used stone tools to process carcasses, cutting away remaining flesh, smashing bones for marrow, and perhaps opening rib cages to eat organs. This was not active hunting, but scavenging from the leftovers of predators. Yet in these seemingly discarded remains lay a hidden treasure of nutrition. Bone marrow was rich in fats. Animal brains contained the fatty acids essential for neural growth, and meat provided protein to strengthen the body. Homo habilis lacked the skills and tools to bring down large animals themselves, but they were clever enough to move in after predators had fed. With stone tools in hand, they quickly sliced off scraps and withdrew before being noticed. This behavior, repeated over and over, became a survival habit. Without killing, they still gained access to energy that had once belonged solely to the beasts of prey. This ingenuity gave them a crucial edge in a fiercely competitive environment. Even so, meat was only one part of their diet. Homo habilis maintained a varied menu of fruits, nuts, roots, and insects. This flexibility was essential for survival. In the rainy season, fruit was plentiful. In the dry season, they dug for roots or foraged for insects. Whenever a carcass appeared, they exploited it fully. Their adaptability in food choices allowed them to endure climate fluctuations, where reliance on any single source might have meant extinction. The most striking fact, however, is the direct link between high-energy foods and brain development. The brain consumes more energy than any other organ, several times more than muscle. A diet made up solely of nutrient-poor plants could never have supported significant brain expansion. But with the addition of meat and marrow, Homo habilis had enough fuel for their brains to grow in both size and complexity. This is one of the reasons their cranial capacity far exceeded that of Australopithecus. Each meal did more than keep them alive. It shaped evolution itself. Individuals who mastered the use of tools to access marrow or nutrient-rich organs gained a survival and reproductive advantage. Over time, traits that supported tool use and animal exploitation were reinforced across generations. Food and intelligence created a feedback loop, each feeding into the other, propelling Homo habilis further along the path to becoming truly human. Their meals were never abundant. They had no concept of storage, no way to preserve food for long. But that constant scarcity sharpened their wits. They learned to observe predator behavior, to recognize the smell of carrion from afar, to wield their tools with maximum efficiency. And with every bite of meat, every sip of marrow, every crushed nut, their brains were nourished, growing stronger with each generation. In the wind sweeping across the savanna, in the blood scent lingering on carcasses, in the sweet tang of ripe fruit, Homo habilis found the balance of survival. They were no longer just gatherers, but beings who shaped their world through tools, intelligence, and a diverse diet. And this change, quiet though it seemed, paved the way for the great leaps yet to come in humanity's long journey. The shift in the diet of Homo habilis was not simply a matter of survival. It was a driving force behind the growth of intelligence and the dawn of early culture. With more abundant energy, their brains did not just increase in size. Their capacity for thought expanded as well. A cranial volume of 600 to 700 cm may seem small compared to modern humans, but at the time, it was a monumental leap from Australopithecus. A larger brain allowed Homo habilis to process information more effectively, to remember where food sources were located, to distinguish edible fruits from poisonous ones, to recognize danger signals from afar, and even to anticipate predator behavior. In a harsh world, memory and observation became their weapons. An individual who remembered that fruit ripened by the river during the rainy season, or that carcasses were often left in a rocky crevice after hyenas fed, had a far greater chance of survival. At the same time, a bigger brain also enabled more refined communication. Alarm calls, shrieks, and cries gradually moved beyond mere instinctive reactions and began to carry more specific meanings. One sound could signal the presence of a predator. Another could point to food nearby. This growing complexity in communication improved group coordination and laid the foundations for the emergence of language. A high-energy diet also freed Homo habilis from the constant burden of foraging. In nature, many herbivores, such as gorillas, must spend hours each day chewing leaves just to sustain themselves. But thanks to calorie-rich meat and marrow, Homo habilis spent less time eating, which meant more time for social interaction and learning. This was a quiet but crucial advancement, for it opened the door to more complex social relationships. Another consequence of their new diet was a change in body structure. As the brain expanded, the skull grew to accommodate it, while the teeth and jaws gradually became smaller, no longer needed for grinding, tough vegetation as before. Jawbones thinned, canines diminished, but the brain increasingly dominated. This shift marked the transition from a creature that relied primarily on brute strength to one that depended on intelligence. One can imagine that within their groups, individuals who discovered new ways to exploit food became central figures. The one who learned to crack bones for marrow, to recognize non-poisonous fruits, or to locate root patches would naturally gain respect. This fostered the beginnings of role differentiation. Some observed, some searched, some processed food, while others kept watch. Though not yet a structured society, this sharing of roles already set them apart from other primates. Thanks to meat, Homo habilis could also travel farther. High-calorie foods gave them the endurance to cover longer distances in search of resources, gradually extending their range across East Africa. This slow expansion laid the groundwork for the great migrations of Homo erectus that would come later. All of these changes stemmed from what seemed a simple shift: adding meat and marrow to their diet. It was not merely another food source, but the engine of a cascade of biological, behavioral, and social transformations. Homo habilis may never have realized they were laying the foundations of humanity, but every scrap of meat cut with a stone flake, every sip of marrow drawn from a bone, was a brick in the edifice of human intelligence. Thus, the meals of Homo habilis not only sustained them day by day, but quietly wrote an essential chapter in the story of evolution. And from those meals, their brains, nourished and steadily growing, opened the door for future humans to think, to create, and to master the world. In the struggle for survival, the bonds within a Homo habilis group were no less vital than tools or diet. They were far too fragile to live alone, and the need to protect one another gave rise to the beginnings of social life. Small groups of 5 to 10 individuals became the basic unit, each member relying on the community to endure, while also contributing their share of effort to keep it alive. Daily life likely unfolded at a slow yet tense rhythm. With sunrise, the group left its shelter in search of food. The adults led the way, scouting the path, while the young were kept in the middle of a protective ring. Short cries, exchanged glances, and hand gestures carried messages of warning or reassurance. On the tense silence of the savannah, every signal could mean the difference between life and death. Family life among Homo habilis did not yet involve long-term pair bonds, as in modern humans, but the relationship between parent and child remained instinctive and strong. Fossil evidence shows that many juveniles were cared for until maturity, suggesting that mothers did not abandon offspring after birth, but protected and nurtured them. In a world stalked by predators, keeping a child alive required collective effort, not just that of the mother alone. The young were placed at the center of protection, fed with soft meat or ripe fruit. When a weak or injured child slowed the group, members often adjusted their pace and shared food to keep it alive. This behavior went beyond simple survival instinct. Sacrifice for the next generation was the surest way to preserve the species. In such simple acts, we glimpse the earliest seeds of family and community. Roles within the group began to emerge. Some individuals, braver than others, took the lead in finding food. Some, more skillful, were adept at processing meat with tools. Some, more alert, were the first to detect danger. Diversity of personality and ability strengthened the whole, and over time, Homo habilis came to understand that true power lay not in the individual, but in the group. Picture a late afternoon on the savannah. A band of Homo habilis has found a carcass left behind by lions. A few step forward, cutting meat with stone flakes, while others stand guard. Children wait behind, watching intently. When the meat is divided, each piece is passed from hand to hand, not always evenly, but enough that every member receives something. In that moment, sharing was not only survival, but the first step towards social bonding. This early social life became the foundation for more complex communities to come. Their existence proves that to survive, humans could not rely on themselves alone. They needed connection, a collective embrace. And at the heart of that embrace was the family, the nucleus, where life was sustained and the future preserved. Archaeological evidence suggests this cohesion was real. Fossil remains of multiple Homo habilis individuals are often found together, implying they lived not as wanderers, but as clusters. Each cluster was likely an extended family, with several generations bound together by mutual dependence. Gender roles also began to emerge, though in primitive form. Stronger individuals, often males, may have taken on the risks of approaching carcasses or confronting predators, while females focused more on gathering fruit, roots, and seeds, and on caring for young. Yet these roles were not rigid, for in such a harsh environment, every individual had to remain flexible, ready to take on any task the situation demanded. Children lay at the center of all concern. Unlike some primates, where offspring may be abandoned if the mother dies, Homo habilis shows signs of extended care. Fossils reveal young individuals who survived illness or injury into adulthood, evidence that their group had supported and protected them, rather than letting nature take its course. This marked a social behavior beyond instinct, an early expression of compassion and sacrifice. In the evenings, huddled in caves or perched in trees, Homo habilis likely spent time close together, exchanging cries, gestures, and glances. These moments nourished social ties. We may never know exactly how they communicated, but their ability to cooperate for survival required a deeper level of understanding than any other primates of their time. For them, family and group life were not choices, they were necessities. Their cohesion also extended to sharing knowledge. An individual who found a fruiting tree or a patch of roots may have led the group there. Sharing resources built trust within the community. A selfish individual who kept food hidden would endanger the group's survival, and in time, such behavior would not be tolerated. Cooperation, instead, strengthened the group and became the seed of human social order. Emotional bonds began to take shape as well. When one member fell, there were no burial rituals as in later humans, but perhaps there were cries, lingering around the body, or gestures of grief. Though uncertain, the evidence of collective living, childcare, and support for the sick suggests that Homo habilis already felt connections beyond mere survival instinct. Here lay the roots of family love and human society. Every day survived on the savanna was proof that Homo habilis endured not only by the strength of their tools, but by the strength of their community. Family and social bonds were the invisible shield that protected them against nature's trials. In the dim light of dusk, when the group gathered close, sheltering their young and sharing meager food, one could already see the outline of a profound truth. Humanity was beginning to understand that no one survives alone. The cohesion within Homo habilis groups was not limited to sharing food and protecting the young. It was also evident in the way they coordinated for survival. Archaeological evidence shows that the remains of multiple Homo habilis individuals are often found together, suggesting they did not roam alone, but consistently formed small clusters. Each cluster could be seen as an extended family, where several generations lived and depended on one another. Within the group, gender roles began to take shape in primitive form. The stronger individuals, often males, likely took on the risks of seeking meat from carcasses or confronting predators when danger arose. Meanwhile, females were more closely tied to gathering fruits, roots, and seeds, as well as caring for the young. Yet these boundaries were far from rigid. In such a harsh environment, every member had to remain adaptable, ready to assume any role when necessity demanded. Children were placed at the very center of attention. Unlike many other primates where young may be abandoned if the mother dies, Homo habilis shows signs of prolonged care. Fossils of juveniles bearing evidence of illness or disability, but surviving to adulthood, reveal that the group supported and protected them instead of letting nature eliminate them. This behavior was far beyond mere instinct. hinting at the earliest notions of compassion and sacrifice. In the evenings, gathered in caves or perched in trees, Homo habilis likely spent time close together, exchanging cries, gestures, and glances. These were the moments that nurtured their social bonds. We cannot know precisely how they communicated, but survival through cooperation required a deeper understanding among them than any primate of their time. Family and group life, for Homo habilis, were not choices, but essential conditions for existence. Their cohesion was also expressed through sharing knowledge. A member who found a fruiting tree or a patch rich in roots may have led the group there. Sharing resources built trust within the community. If an individual hoarded food, the survival of the group would be endangered, and sooner or later, that individual would be cast out. By contrast, sharing reinforced bonds and improved the group's overall chances. It was in this environment that the earliest seeds of cooperation took root. Another crucial element was the emergence of emotional attachment. When a member died, they did not yet practice burial rituals as later humans did, but perhaps lingered around the body or expressed distress through cries of grief. Though uncertain, the evidence that Homo habilis lived in groups, protected the young, and cared for the sick strongly suggests they already felt connections that went beyond individual survival. This was the origin of family affection and human social bonds. Every day survived. On the savannah was proof that Homo habilis endured not only through the strength of their tools, but through the strength of their community. Family and social groups were the invisible shields that guarded them against nature's perils. In the dim light of dusk, as the group huddled together, shielding their young and dividing their meager food, one can see a raw but powerful image. Humanity beginning to understand that no one survives alone. One of the most important advances in the social life of Homo habilis was the development of early communication. Though not yet true language, their cries, distinct vocal sounds, gestures, and facial expressions formed an effective system of transmitting information. In a world where danger lurked everywhere, the ability to issue quick warnings and coordinate responses was a matter of survival. When an individual spotted a leopard hidden in the grass, a sharp cry was not just a reflex, it was a meaningful signal, instantly understood by the group. The variety of sounds and gestures reflected the complexity of their collective life. Homo habilis could produce long, low calls to reassure, high-pitched cries to signal alarm, and short, repeated sounds to call one another. Along with these came bodily gestures, pointing, waving, tilting the head, all woven into a rich system of body language. These were the very first seeds of language, the tool that would later become humanity's greatest strength. During rare moments of safety, resting in trees or caves, their communication likely extended beyond warning signals to maintaining group bonds. Infants may have chirped playfully, answered by the low, soothing sounds of their mothers. Adults may have mimicked animal noises to teach the young about dangers. Gradually, communication evolved from a survival reaction into a means of passing on knowledge and experience. This opened the door to collective learning. When one individual discovered how to strike stone more effectively to produce a sharp flake, the act could be demonstrated in front of others. Over time, the skill spread, and tools became shared knowledge. Thus, early communication not only helped them avoid danger, but also ensured that knowledge did not die with a single individual, but lived on through the group and across generations. This was the first step toward culture. The growth of communication also reshaped relationships within the group. The more they understood one another, the more easily they could share food, care for the young, and guard against threats. This built trust, the invisible glue binding individuals into a collective. Primitive as it was, that trust laid the foundation for deeper and more enduring social bonds in the future. In this context, the concept of us began to take shape. A Homo habilis individual was no longer just a solitary being, but a member of a group. Its survival was tied to the survival of the whole, and vice versa. Every cry, every gesture, every action carried meaning and responsibility that extended beyond the self. This was a profound turning point, for the entire framework of modern humanity would later rest upon the idea of community. When night fell on the savannah, groups of Homo habilis gathered together in the darkness of caves or the branches of tall trees, sharing their meager scraps of food, keeping the young safe at the center, listening tensely for sounds outside. In that moment, one can clearly sense the seed of human society. They had no language, no rituals, no laws, but they already knew how to rely on one another, to protect one another, and to endure together. This was the origin of family and community, the two unshakable foundations of humanity to come. Homo habilis emerged mainly in East Africa, where the climate shifted constantly and the savannas steadily expanded. Their fossils and tools have been discovered at famous sites such as Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania and Koobi Fora in Kenya, all located along the Great Lakes and Rift Valleys. These landscapes, with their combination of water sources, wildlife, and diverse terrain, became the cradle of one of the most crucial turning points in human evolution. Their settlement around rivers and lakes was no accident. Water was a lifeline, providing drinking sources as well as attracting plants and animals. Where there was water, there were fruits and tubers along the banks, herds of animals coming to drink, and carcasses left behind for Homo habilis to scavenge. Archaeological sites often reveal stone tools alongside animal bones, proving that these places served as regular hubs for food gathering, though their range was not as vast as that of Homo erectus later on. Homo habilis still displayed remarkable flexibility in choosing habitats. They lived not only in grasslands, but also in open woodlands and even semi-arid regions. This diversity reveals strong adaptive skills despite their small stature and crude tools. Each time the environment shifted, they adjusted, moving to areas richer in food and water. It is noteworthy that Homo habilis never migrated far beyond Africa. Their fossils are concentrated in East Africa, with little to no evidence elsewhere. This shows that their range was still limited, heavily tied to local environmental conditions. Only with the emergence of Homo erectus did humankind take its first steps beyond the African continent. Still, Homo habilis was far from stagnant. Variations in tools and food practices across different sites reveal how they tailored their survival strategies to local resources. In forested areas, they relied more on fruits and tubers. In dry grasslands, they exploited carcasses and dug for underground roots. This adaptability shows that their intelligence was constantly at work, devising ways to overcome hardship. In every small movement across the land, Homo habilis was weaving a deeper connection with the environment. They could not yet leave Africa, but they had learned to make the most of every opportunity nature offered. Each new territory was a challenge, forcing them to adapt and change in order to survive. This process forged the flexibility that would later become a defining trait of humankind. East Africa's climate fluctuated dramatically. Lush forests during heavy rains, cracked earth during droughts. Through these cycles of change, Homo habilis did not vanish. They endured. When the forests thinned, they turned to the grasslands. When the grasslands dried, They clustered around lakes and rivers. Their ability to adapt to climate shifts became one of the most valuable traits passed down to their descendants. The scattered footprints along lake shores, the shattered stone tools left by carcasses, all are signs that Homo habilis was constantly moving and learning. They could not yet travel far, but they proved that intelligence and skill could make up for physical weakness. And from Africa's harsh trials, humanity learned its first great lesson: the power of adaptation. Although Homo habilis left no trace beyond Africa, within that narrow range, they proved an extraordinary ability to adapt to changing environments. Savannas, open woodlands, lake shores, and riverbanks, each habitat posed its own challenges and demanded different strategies. They could not build permanent dwellings, nor store food for long, but through mobility and flexibility, they learned to hold their ground in ever-shifting landscapes. In wooded areas, Homo habilis relied on ripe fruits, easily dug roots, and the cover of trees for protection against predators. As forests thinned and gave way to open grasslands, they faced the dangers of exposed terrain where predators could easily spot them. In such places, vigilance became the essence of survival. They developed the habit of traveling in small groups, both to forage and to be ready to retreat at the first sign of danger. The lakes and rivers told a different story. Water was life, but it drew every creature: herds of antelope, ancient elephants, primitive zebras, and the predators that hunted them. Homo habilis came as well, seeking water, plucking fruit along the banks, and most importantly, scavenging drowned animals or carcasses left behind by hunters. Many stone tools found near ancient lakes and rivers confirm that these were frequent temporary camps. Yet water also meant risk. Giant crocodiles and aggressive hippos lurked beneath the surface. Every visit to the river's edge was both an opportunity and a gamble with death. The climate of East Africa during the age of Homo habilis was anything but stable. Long periods of heavy rain brought lush vegetation and abundant wildlife, while harsh droughts cracked the earth, withered plants, and dried rivers. In hard times, Homo habilis endured by broadening their diet. They dug for roots, searched for insects and larvae in rotting wood, and exploited whatever source of food remained. This dietary flexibility allowed them to survive environmental upheavals that wiped out less adaptable species. Adaptation meant more than food. It meant movement. Homo habilis did not wander aimlessly. They remembered. They recalled where fruiting trees had grown in past seasons, where water still lingered in the dry months, where shelter could be found. Such memory laid the earliest foundations of territory, not lands held by force, but familiar spaces tied to collective memory and experience. From an evolutionary perspective, these short steps around the savanna and lake shores of Homo habilis laid the groundwork for the great migrations of Homo erectus. If habilis had not learned to adapt, to expand their search, their descendants would never have been capable of leaving Africa. Every shift of a few miles was practice for the vast journeys that came hundreds of thousands of years later. Homo habilis never left Africa, but they left behind a priceless legacy: flexibility. They proved that humans could survive in many environments, so long as they had the intelligence to adapt. From woodland to grassland, from riverbank to arid plain, they continually adjusted their way of life. Their story is a reminder that from the very beginning, humanity has survived by learning how to change. For hundreds of thousands of years, Homo habilis endured in Africa. Then slowly, their trace faded from the fossil record. There was no single catastrophe, no sudden extinction. Their disappearance was quiet, gradual, like a small flame dimming until it was replaced by a brighter, stronger fire, the fire of Homo erectus. Around 1.9 million years ago, Homo erectus emerged with clear advantages. They were taller, stronger, and most importantly, their brains were far larger, reaching 900 to 1,000 centimeters. They not only crafted tools, but made refined, symmetrical hand axes for multiple uses. They were also the first humans to control fire, a discovery that transformed survival itself. Against the strength of Homo erectus, Homo habilis grew faint. In the same environment, the two species likely competed directly. Erectus, with their size and skill, secured food more effectively, hunted with greater success, and defended their groups better. Habilis, smaller and less capable, were left to scraps and dwindling resources. Over time, the balance tipped entirely toward Erectus, pushing Habilis into marginal lands. Meanwhile, Africa's climate continued to change. Expanding savannas and shrinking forests demanded even greater adaptation. With advanced tools and mastery of fire, Erectus thrived. Habilis, reliant on crude implements and small-scale mobility, fell into disadvantage. Each environmental shift further narrowed their chances. There may even have been encounters between the two species, both drawn to carcasses, rivers, and fruit-bearing trees. In such meetings, the stronger, better organized, and better armed Erectus would have prevailed. Habilis, weaker in both body and mind, were gradually pushed aside, like a branch overshadowed by a larger canopy. Significantly, the disappearance of Homo habilis was not a sudden death of a species, but a quiet absorption into evolution's flow. Some scientists suggest that they may not have vanished entirely, but that part of their genetic legacy blended into early Erectus populations. Though debated, this possibility hints that Habilis was not merely extinguished, but helped shape the very species that replaced them. Whatever the case, by about 1.5 million years ago, Homo habilis no longer appeared in the fossil record. The handyman became a closed chapter, making way for longer strides, larger brains, and a new era of humankind. Yet their quiet end was not meaningless, for without Habilis, there would have been no Erectus, and without Erectus, no Homo sapiens. Homo habilis vanished without roar or spectacle. They disappeared as they had lived, humble, small, yet deeply significant. And in their fading, they cleared the path for their successors to continue writing humanity's long story. Homo habilis lived for hundreds of thousands of years on African soil, but at some point, their traces began to fade from the geological record. There is no single event that marks a collective death, nor is there evidence of a sudden catastrophe that wiped them out. Their disappearance happened quietly, gradually, like a small flame slowly dimming until it was replaced by another, brighter and stronger flame. That flame bore the name Homo erectus. When Homo erectus appeared around 1.9 million years ago, they brought with them decisive advantages. They were taller, stronger, and, most significantly, had much larger brains, ranging from 900 to 1,000 pound ME3s. They not only made tools, but crafted finely shaped, symmetrical hand axes that could serve many purposes. They were also the first humans to master fire, an invention that forever changed the course of survival. Against the strength of Homo erectus, Homo habilis grew faint. Sharing the same environment, the two species may have competed intensely. Erectus, with their larger build, could secure food more easily, hunt more effectively, and protect their groups better. Meanwhile, the smaller habilis relied only on scraps of meat and whatever food remained. Over time, the balance tipped entirely in favor of Erectus, pushing habilis into less favorable territories. The climate of East Africa during that era continued to shift. Expanding savannas and shrinking forests forced all species to adjust to drier, harsher conditions. Homo erectus, with their advanced tools and control of fire, adapted far more successfully. Habilis, still dependent on mobility and crude implements, faced growing disadvantages. With each climatic change, their chances of survival narrowed further. It is possible that there were times when Homo habilis and Homo erectus crossed paths, scavenging the same carcasses, gathering at the same waterholes, vying for the same ripe fruits. In those encounters, the stronger, more organized, and better equipped Erectus inevitably prevailed. Habilis, weaker both physically and mentally, was gradually pushed from the center of life, like a smaller branch overshadowed by a broader canopy. What is striking is that the disappearance of Homo habilis was not the sudden death of a species, but rather a merging into the stream of evolution. Some scientists suggest that Habilis may not have vanished entirely, but that part of their genetic heritage flowed into the earliest populations of Erectus. Though still debated, this possibility hints that they did not simply die out, but may have directly contributed to the rise of their successors. Whatever the case, by about 1.5 million years ago, Homo habilis no longer appeared in the fossil record. The handyman became a closed chapter, making way for longer strides, larger brains, and a new era of humanity. Yet their silent end was not meaningless, for without habilis, there may never have been Erectus, and without Erectus, no Homo sapiens. Homo habilis vanished without roar or spectacle. They disappeared as they had lived, humble, small, but full of meaning. And in their quiet passing, they cleared the path for their successors to continue writing the long story of humankind. Looking back at the disappearance of Homo habilis, it is clear that it was not a single event, but the result of multiple factors combined over hundreds of thousands of years. One of the most crucial causes was competition for resources. Homo erectus was not only stronger, but also used more advanced tools to exploit the very food sources habilis once relied upon. If habilis had once cracked bones for marrow, Erectus did it better, faster, and added active hunting to their skills. Whatever small advantage habilis had soon vanished. Africa's climate grew harsher as well. Prolonged droughts dried up lakes. Plant foods became scarce, and species fought more fiercely for survival. In such conditions, Erectus, with their taller, stronger bodies, could travel farther to find new resources, while the smaller-framed habilis were more limited. A physical difference that had once been minor in wooded environments now became a matter of life and death. Some researchers suggest that social differences also played a role in the extinction of Homo habilis. Erectus is thought to have developed more complex social structures, with clearer divisions of labor and cooperation in hunting. By contrast, habilis still relied heavily on opportunism, scavenging carcasses, and gathering plants. This gap in organization gave Erectus an ever-growing advantage, while Habilis fell behind. There is also a theory that Habilis and Erectus coexisted for a long time, perhaps hundreds of thousands of years. During that period, they may have overlapped in territory and even interbred, producing hybrid generations. If this hypothesis is correct, Homo habilis did not disappear entirely. Part of their genetic legacy may have continued within Erectus. Still, in terms of fossils, Habilis as a distinct species gradually disappeared from the evolutionary record. The quiet vanishing of Homo habilis reflects nature's unforgiving law. Not every species that arises is destined to last forever, and not every disappearance is meaningless. Each evolutionary branch, whether short or long, contributes to the whole. Habilis was like the first brick laid in the foundation of the vast house called humanity. That brick may no longer remain, but without it, the structure could never stand. It is difficult to imagine the final moments of Homo habilis. There was no battle drum, no catastrophic event, just dwindling groups, fewer and fewer voices echoing across the wide land, until the last traces faded into the layers of earth and stone. And then, only Homo erectus remained to carry the story forward, bearing with them fragments of memory from their clever yet fragile ancestors, and continuing the great saga of humankind. As Homo habilis quietly left the stage of evolution, their disappearance did not only leave a gap in the fossil record, but also raised questions that remain unanswered. Were they completely replaced by Homo erectus through direct competition? Or did they gradually transform and merge into the new species? To this day, science continues to debate. Some hypotheses suggest that habilis was the transitional link, a small branch that evolved into erectus, meaning they did not truly go extinct, but became the direct ancestors of the next human species. Others argue that habilis and erectus lived side by side as two distinct branches, with habilis slowly eliminated as the environment and competition grew harsher. Whatever the truth, one certainty is that the disappearance of Homo habilis happened in silence. There is no geological evidence of a global catastrophe, nor signs of a devastating plague. Instead, their decline resembled an oil lamp slowly burning out, its light fading little by little until it was gone. It was the unforgiving law of nature. Any species that fails to adapt to environmental change and competition will eventually vanish. Homo erectus, with their taller bodies, larger brains, and mastery of fire, came to dominate the landscapes once held by habilis. Fire did more than provide warmth and light. It completely shifted the balance of power on the savanna. While habilis still trembled in the dark, erectus sat around campfires, driving away predators, cooking food, and opening a new world of possibilities. That moment marked the true end of the habilis age. And yet, even in disappearance, habilis left an indelible mark. They were the first to truly craft tools, the first to prove that intelligence could change the terms of survival. Without that beginning, erectus would have had no foundation to build upon, and sapiens, the modern human, would never have emerged. Their vanishing was not a failure, but a handover. Today, when archaeologists lift an Olduvai flake or a fossil bone stained with red earth, they find not only evidence of a lost species, but also hear the faint echoes of Homo habilis. Those echoes remind us that humanity was built upon countless efforts, countless sacrifices, and the silent disappearances of species along the way. Homo habilis, clever yet fragile, left the evolutionary stage not in glory, but in quiet retreat. Yet it was precisely this quietness that became the foundation, allowing their successors to write new chapters in the human story. And though they are no longer present, they live on in the legacy of intelligence that humanity continues to carry forward to this day. When Homo habilis disappeared from the fossil record, they left a gap, but not a meaningless one. On the contrary, what they accomplished became the solid foundation for the entire course of human evolution. Homo habilis was not the strongest species, nor the most intelligent, and certainly not the longest lived, but they were the beginning. The first stone laid in the great edifice of humankind. Their most obvious legacy was tools. From the crude Olduvai stones, Homo habilis proved that nature was not only something to endure, but something that could be reshaped and used. A broken stone with a sharp edge, small as it was, opened the door to an age of technology that continues to this day. Without that first invention, Homo erectus would never have had the hand axe. Neanderthals would never have had stone spears, and Homo sapiens would never have had bows, wheels, or machines. Every tool of the modern world, from the dagger to the computer, can be traced back to the first shard of stone in the hands of Homo habilis. Their second legacy was the diet that reshaped the brain. By exploiting meat and marrow, Homo habilis nourished a brain that was larger and smarter, paving the way for later intellectual breakthroughs. They were not great hunters, but their cleverness in seizing opportunities allowed them to survive, and at the same time, shaped the way humans sought energy to fuel intelligence. Every scrap of meat they scavenged was more than food. It was a stepping stone in the evolution of the human mind. Their third legacy lay in social life. Homo habilis demonstrated that strength did not lie in the individual, but in the group. They huddled together to protect their young, shared food, and cooperated in the face of danger. That cohesion, however primitive, became an inseparable essence of humanity. Today's modern societies, our cities, nations, and civilizations all trace their roots to the small bands of Homo habilis gathered together in the darkness of the savannah. More than their tools, more than their diet or their social bonds, the greatest legacy of Homo habilis was the proof that intelligence could change destiny. A small species with no claws, no fangs, no brute strength, creatures that by all rights should have been erased by predators, endured and advanced through sheer ingenuity. Their story is a reminder that creativity and adaptability matter more than raw power. This has been the enduring message of humanity, from the distant past to the present day. Today, as we sit under electric light, as skyscrapers reflect the brilliance and effort of our species, few stop to think that it all began with a small group of Homo habilis holding shards of stone. But that is the truth. Every step forward we take carries within it the shadow of those skillful ancestors. They turned fragility into strength, smallness into an immortal mark, and left behind a legacy that cannot be erased from the story of humankind. The legacy of Homo habilis was not confined to stone tools or the traces of meals they left behind. It lay also in the way they ignited humanity's intellectual journey. Before habilis, the existence of hominins was bound only by instinct. But the moment they picked up a stone and used it for a specific purpose, humankind crossed a threshold. From then on, evolution was no longer just the work of blind nature, but also of conscious choice. Homo habilis also left a vital spiritual legacy, the ability to learn and to pass knowledge on. Intelligence no longer ended with the death of an individual, but could be transmitted through action and observation. A child, watching its parents strike a stone to make a sharp flake, would imitate the gesture until mastery came. Knowledge, thus moved beyond the limits of one life to become a collective inheritance. This was the seed of culture, a trait unique to humans. Moreover, Homo habilis planted the earliest seeds of community consciousness, the very element that distinguishes humans from other species. Their care for the weak, their protection of the sick, and their sharing of food were not simply survival instincts, but expressions of compassion. That compassion would later grow into empathy, love, and the moral systems of humanity. Without those first steps, today's human societies could never have formed. In truth, Homo habilis left quietly, but their legacy never disappeared. Every time we hold a tool, from a pen to a knife to a smartphone, we extend the line begun by those first clever hands striking stone. Every time we share knowledge, through a teacher's words or the pages of a book, we echo their first acts of passing down skills. And every time we care for one another, protect children, or tend to the sick, we continue a thread first woven by small habilis groups on the ancient savanna. They left no stone monuments, no cities, no written words, but they left something far more precious, the foundation upon which humanity could rise. Thanks to them, Homo erectus could go further. Homo sapiens could create civilization. And we today can sit and tell their story. Their legacy does not rest only in fossils or tools, but flows in every cell, every thought, and every step of modern humans. Homo habilis vanished quietly from the world, but never from history. They were the forgotten dawn of humanity, and it was in that pale light that the long road of humankind first began. The story of Homo habilis does not end in glory, but in a quiet fade that stretched across hundreds of thousands of years. They lived, they endured, they adapted, and then they disappeared, yielding the stage to Homo erectus, a species stronger and more intelligent. Yet that silence was not meaningless, for it marked the opening chapter of humanity's unending story. On the dark plains of Africa, Homo habilis lifted the first stone and turned it into a tool. That simple act, seemingly insignificant, was in truth the beginning of everything. From that chipped stone came the bronze spear, the iron axe, the steam engine, and even the spacecraft. The journey, millions of years long, began with the fragile but skillful hands of Homo habilis. They left behind more than tools. They laid the foundation for society and culture. When an individual cared for a sick child, when a small group shared scraps of meat, when alarm calls pierced the night, humankind learned its first lesson in connection. That lesson carried forward through history, from early tribes to modern cities, from small communities to vast civilizations. Homo habilis also left a spiritual legacy, the will to survive through intelligence. They had no claws, no fangs, no brute strength, but they had ingenuity. It was this ingenuity that earned them the name Homo habilis, handy man, and it remains the most vital trait passed down to us. From them, we inherited the refusal to surrender to nature, and the drive instead to adapt, reshape, and master it. Looking back, Homo habilis was not merely a species that vanished, but a symbol of beginnings. They were like the faint glow of dawn after a long night. Not dazzling, but enough to signal a new day. From that pale light rose the great journeys of Homo erectus, Homo sapiens, and the whole of humanity. Today, as humans set foot on the moon, launch spacecraft beyond the solar system, and probe the mysteries of the universe, we often think of the future, but seldom remember that it all began with the simplest of acts. A small band of Homo habilis, trembling in the night, sharing scraps of food, were our ancestors. And from that moment, the path to today was opened. If we could return to the past, we would see that Homo habilis was not so different from us in essence. They knew fear, they protected their young, and they relied on one another to survive. It is this kinship that makes their story feel so close. They are not just fossils in a museum, nor just a name in textbooks, but a mirror reflecting the distant origins of every modern human. Perhaps the greatest message Homo habilis left us is this: existence does not need to be grand to be meaningful. Sometimes, to survive, to be clever, to take small steps forward, is enough to open the door to the future. Habilis did exactly that, and because of them, we can tell this story today. The story closes here, but its echoes remain. Homo Habilis is gone, yet their legacy lives on in every tool, every act of cooperation, every spark of human creativity. They were the forgotten dawn, but it was that very dawn that lit the path to modern humanity. And when we look back, we understand that no step in evolution is ever wasted, for even the quietest ones can leave an eternal resonance.